Marcus Williams adjusted his rearview mirror as he drove down the quiet street toward his apartment. The sun was setting behind the tall buildings, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. He had just finished his weekly volunteer work at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, where he spent time talking with wounded soldiers who had recently returned from overseas missions. The work was close to his heart because Marcus understood their struggles better than most people. At 32 years old, Marcus was a decorated Navy SEAL who had served his country with honor for over 10 years. He had completed 3 dangerous tours in Afghanistan, where he had saved countless lives and earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. His chest was covered with medals that told the story of his bravery and dedication to protecting America. Now that he was back home, Marcus worked as a military consultant, helping train new recruits and sharing his knowledge with the next generation of warriors. But Marcus had bigger dreams for his future. Every evening after work, he would open his law books and study for hours. He was pursuing his law degree because he wanted to help veterans navigate the complex legal system when they returned home. Too many good soldiers were struggling with paperwork, benefits, and legal issues that they did not understand. Marcus wanted to be the person who could guide them through these challenges. As he drove through the residential neighborhood, Marcus noticed his fuel gauge was getting low. He made a mental note to stop at the gas station on the corner before heading home. The radio played soft jazz music, and Marcus found himself relaxing for the first time all day. The hospital visits were always emotional, but they reminded him why his service had been so important. Suddenly, bright red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as he looked at his speedometer. He was driving 25 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. He had been going 5 miles under the speed limit, being extra careful as he always was when driving through neighborhoods where children might be playing. Marcus pulled his car to the side of the road and turned off the engine. He placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. His military training had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings and to follow proper procedures in any situation. He knew that traffic stops could be dangerous for both drivers and police officers, so he wanted to make sure everything went smoothly. Officer Rodriguez walked up to the driver's side window with a stern expression on his face. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair at his temples and a thick mustache. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and his badge gleamed in the light from the street lamps that had just turned on. License and registration. Officer Rodriguez demanded in a harsh voice that seemed unnecessarily aggressive for a routine traffic stop. Marcus reached slowly into his wallet and pulled out his driver's license. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why you pulled me over?" he asked politely. "You were speeding," the officer replied quickly, though Marcus knew this was not true. "I was actually going under the speed limit, sir," Marcus said respectfully. "My speedometer showed 25 in a 30 zone." Officer Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as he looked at Marcus's license. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Marcus felt confused by the request. He had been cooperative and respectful, and there was no reason for him to get out of his car for a simple traffic ticket. But he knew that arguing with a police officer could make things worse, so he slowly opened his door and stepped onto the sidewalk. The officer began asking Marcus questions about where he was going and where he had been. Marcus answered honestly, explaining that he had been volunteering at the VA hospital. When Officer Rodriguez asked for permission to search his car, Marcus felt uncomfortable, but agreed because he had nothing to hide. As the officer searched through his car, he found Marcus's military identification card and his medal case in the glove compartment. Instead of showing respect for Marcus's service, Officer Rodriguez seemed to become even more hostile. He held up the military ID and looked at Marcus with suspicion. "So you think you're some kind of hero?" the officer asked with a sneer in his voice. Marcus was shocked by the officer's attitude. Throughout his life, people had always thanked him for his service and treated him with respect when they learned about his military background. He had never encountered someone who seemed angry about his service to his country. "I just served my country, sir," Marcus replied quietly. trying to keep the situation calm. But Officer Rodriguez continued to make negative comments about Marcus's military service. He questioned whether someone like Marcus belonged in an elite unit like the Navy SEALs. His words were filled with prejudice and hatred that Marcus had hoped he would never encounter in his own country. The traffic stop that should have lasted 5 minutes stretched into 30 minutes as Officer Rodriguez continued his unnecessary search and hostile questioning. Marcus remained calm and polite throughout the ordeal, but inside he felt confused and hurt by the treatment he was receiving from someone who was supposed to protect and serve the community. Little did Marcus know that this traffic stop would change his life forever and lead him into a legal battle that would test everything he believed about justice and equality in America. The situation took a dramatic turn when Officer Rodriguez suddenly grabbed Marcus by the arm and spun him around. Marcus was completely surprised by this aggressive action because he had been cooperating fully throughout the entire traffic stop. The officer quickly pulled out his handcuffs and began placing them on Marcus's wrists while speaking in a loud, angry voice. "You are under arrest for resisting arrest and disorderly conduct," Officer Rodriguez announced as he tightened the metal cuffs around Marcus's hands. Marcus felt his mind racing as he tried to understand what was happening. He had not resisted anything during the traffic stop. In fact, he had been exceptionally polite and had followed every instruction the officer had given him. He had answered all questions honestly and had even allowed the unnecessary search of his vehicle without complaint. The charges made absolutely no sense. "Officer, I think there has been some mistake," Marcus said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady despite the shock of being arrested. "I have been cooperative throughout this entire stop. I have not resisted anything or caused any disturbance." But Officer Rodriguez ignored his words and began pushing him toward the police car. As Marcus walked with his hands cuffed behind his back, he noticed several neighbors had come out of their houses to see what was happening. Some of them recognized Marcus from the neighborhood and looked confused by what they were witnessing. A few people even started recording the arrest with their cell phones. The ride to the police station was humiliating for Marcus. He sat in the back of the patrol car with his hands still cuffed, thinking about how quickly his peaceful evening had turned into a nightmare. He thought about his grandfather, who had told him stories about facing similar treatment during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Marcus had always hoped that those days were behind them, but now he was experiencing the same kind of injustice firsthand. At the police station, Marcus was processed like any other criminal suspect. Officer Rodriguez filled out paperwork that contained completely false information about what had happened during the traffic stop. The report claimed that Marcus had been verbally aggressive, had refused to follow commands, and had made threatening gestures toward the officer. None of these things had actually happened, but Marcus knew it would be his word against the officer's word. During the booking process, Marcus asked repeatedly to call this lawyer. The desk sergeant, a man named Thompson who seemed more reasonable than Officer Rodriguez, initially told Marcus he would have to wait. Sergeant Thompson appeared uncomfortable with the whole situation and kept glancing at Marcus with what looked like sympathy in his eyes. "I know who you are," Sergeant Thompson said quietly when Officer Rodriguez stepped away to use the restroom. "My son served in the Marines. Thank you for your service." Marcus nodded gratefully at the sergeant's words, but he could see that Thompson was not willing to speak up against his fellow officer. The unspoken code of loyalty among police officers was stronger than Thompson's personal feelings about the unfair treatment Marcus was receiving. Finally, after several hours of waiting, Marcus was allowed to make one phone call. He contacted his lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen who had helped him with some legal issues related to his military benefits in the past. Sarah was shocked to hear about Marcus's arrest and promised to come to the station immediately. While waiting for his lawyer to arrive, Marcus was placed in a holding cell with several other men who had been arrested that evening. The cell was small and uncomfortable, with concrete walls and a single metal bench. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating an annoying sound that made it difficult to think clearly. The other inmates were curious about Marcus when they learned he was a Navy SEAL. Some of them expressed disbelief that someone with his background and achievements could end up in the same situation they were in. Others offered words of support and encouragement, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment by the police. "Man, if they can do this to you, they can do it to anybody," said one older gentleman who had been arrested for a minor traffic violation. "You serve your country and everything, and they still treating you like this." Marcus spent the long night reflecting on his situation. He thought about all the battles he had fought overseas, all the times he had risked his life to protect American values and freedoms. Now he was sitting in a jail cell, falsely accused of crimes he had not committed, simply because of one officer's prejudice and abuse of power. He also thought about his law studies and how this experience was giving him a first-hand understanding of the flaws in the justice system. Marcus had always believed that truth and evidence would prevail in court, but now he was beginning to realize that the system was not always fair or just. As dawn broke through the small window of the holding cell, Marcus knew that his real fight was just beginning. The false charges against him were serious, and if convicted, they could destroy his reputation and his future career plans. But Marcus was determined to clear his name and expose the injustice he had experienced. When Sarah Chen finally arrived at the station the next morning, she found Marcus tired but resolute. He told her exactly what had happened during the traffic stop, and she carefully took notes on every detail. Sarah could see the determination in Marcus's eyes and knew that this case would be about much more than just clearing his name. 3 weeks after his arrest, Marcus walked into the courthouse wearing his best navy blue suit. His lawyer, Sarah Chen, had advised him to dress professionally and to remain calm no matter what happened during the proceedings. The courthouse was an impressive building with tall marble columns and American flags hanging from the ceiling. Marcus had always believed that courthouses represented justice and fairness, but today he felt nervous about what lay ahead. As they entered the courtroom, Marcus noticed that many people had come to support him. The wooden benches were filled with his fellow veterans, members of his church, and neighbors from his community. Some of them wore their military uniforms to show solidarity with Marcus. Their presence gave him strength and reminded him that he was not alone in this fight. Judge William Harrison entered the courtroom through a side door, and everyone stood up as required by law. The judge was a tall, thin man in his 60s with gray hair and cold blue eyes. He wore the traditional black robe and carried himself with an air of authority that seemed intimidating. Marcus had heard stories about Judge Harrison from other lawyers, and most of them were not positive. Sarah Chen had warned Marcus about the judge's reputation during their preparation meetings. Judge Harrison was known throughout the legal community for being especially harsh with defendants, particularly those from minority backgrounds. Many lawyers whispered that the judge had old-fashioned views about race and social issues, but he was careful to hide his prejudices behind legal language. The prosecutor was a young woman named Lisa Martinez who seemed eager to make a name for herself in the district attorney's office. She had arranged her papers neatly on the table and kept glancing at Marcus with a confident expression. Sarah had told Marcus that Prosecutor Martinez was ambitious and would likely push hard for a conviction to advance her career. As the trial began, Judge Harrison's attitude became immediately apparent. When Prosecutor Martinez stood up to present the state's case, the judge nodded approvingly and listened carefully to every word she said. But when Sarah Chen tried to make objections or present evidence that favored Marcus, Judge Harrison seemed annoyed and impatient. The prosecution's first witness was Officer Rodriguez, who took the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. Marcus watched carefully as the officer began telling his version of what had happened during the traffic stop. Rodriguez claimed that Marcus had been driving recklessly and had become hostile when pulled over. He testified that Marcus had refused to follow instructions and had made threatening gestures. Marcus felt his anger rising as he listened to these lies, but Sarah had taught him to control his emotions in the courtroom. He knew that showing anger would only hurt his case, so he forced himself to remain calm and composed. But inside, he was shocked by how easily Officer Rodriguez was lying under oath. When it was Sarah's turn to cross-examine Officer Rodriguez, she began asking detailed questions about his report. She wanted to know exactly what time the traffic stop had occurred, what the weather conditions were like, and how many other cars were on the road. With each question, small inconsistencies began to appear in the officer's testimony. Sarah then presented video evidence from a security camera at a nearby business that had captured part of the traffic stop. The video clearly showed Marcus cooperating with the officer and following all instructions. It also showed that Marcus had not made any threatening gestures or acted aggressively in any way. However, Judge Harrison seemed determined to ignore this crucial evidence. When Sarah tried to emphasize important details from the video, the judge cut her off and told her to move on. When Prosecutor Martinez objected to questions that were clearly appropriate, Judge Harrison sustained her objections without proper justification. The people in the gallery began to notice the judge's unfair treatment of Marcus and his lawyer. Several veterans exchanged worried glances, and Marcus could hear quiet whispers of disapproval from his supporters. They could see that the trial was not being conducted fairly, but they remained respectful of the court proceedings. During the lunch break, Sarah pulled Marcus aside to discuss what was happening. She told him that Judge Harrison's behavior was highly unusual and potentially grounds for an appeal. She had been practicing law for 15 years and had never seen such obvious bias from a judge. "This is not normal, Marcus," Sarah said with concern in her voice. "Judge Harrison is clearly not giving you a fair trial. He is ignoring evidence that proves your innocence and accepting everything the prosecution says without question." Marcus nodded, but he was not surprised by the judge's behavior. He had suspected from the beginning that his case would not be handled fairly. The same prejudice that had motivated Officer Rodriguez to arrest him was now influencing Judge Harrison's decisions in the courtroom. When court resumed after lunch, more character witnesses testified on Marcus' behalf. His former commanding officers spoke about his exemplary service record and his reputation for integrity. Fellow veterans described his volunteer work and his commitment to helping other soldiers. Church members talked about his community involvement and his strong moral character. But Judge Harrison seemed unimpressed by these testimonies. He often looked bored during the character witness presentations and occasionally checked his watch as if he had more important things to do. The contrast between his attention to the prosecution's case and his dismissal of the defense was becoming more obvious with each passing hour. As the first day of trial ended, Marcus felt discouraged but not defeated. He knew that justice was not always easy to achieve, but he was determined to fight for his rights and his reputation. The support from his community gave him hope that truth would eventually prevail, even in the face of obvious prejudice and unfair treatment. The second day of the trial began with more shocking revelations about Judge Harrison's history of unfair treatment toward minority defendants. Sarah Chen had spent the previous evening researching the judge's past cases, and what she discovered was deeply troubling. She had found clear evidence that Judge Harrison consistently gave harsher sentences to African American defendants compared to white defendants who had committed similar or even worse crimes. Sarah presented her research to the court, showing that in the past 5 years, Judge Harrison had sentenced white defendants to an average of 6 months in jail for resisting arrest charges, while African American defendants received an average of 18 months for the same offense. The statistics were so obvious that even Prosecutor Martinez seemed uncomfortable when Sarah read them aloud in court. "Your Honor," Sarah said respectfully but firmly, "these numbers show a clear pattern of unequal treatment based on race. My client deserves the same fair consideration that would be given to any other defendant in this courtroom." Judge Harrison's face turned red with anger at Sarah's accusations. He pounded his gavel several times and threatened to hold her in contempt of court for questioning his integrity. But Sarah stood her ground, knowing that she was fighting for more than just Marcus's freedom. She was fighting against a system that allowed prejudiced judges to destroy lives based on skin color. The prosecution continued their case by calling additional witnesses, but their testimony only made Officer Rodriguez's lies more obvious. A medical examiner testified that Marcus had no injuries consistent with a physical struggle, which contradicted the officer's claim that Marcus had resisted arrest. A forensic expert explained that Marcus's car showed no signs of reckless driving, which disproved the speeding allegation. Despite this overwhelming evidence proving Marcus's innocence, Judge Harrison continued to show favoritism toward the prosecution. When Sarah objected to inappropriate questions from Prosecutor Martinez, the judge overruled her objections without explanation. When Prosecutor Martinez objected to perfectly legitimate questions from Sarah, Judge Harrison sustained those objections immediately. During the cross-examination of Officer Rodriguez, Sarah was able to expose even more inconsistencies in his testimony. The officer could not explain why he had pulled Marcus over in the first place, since Marcus had been driving under the speed limit. He could not describe the specific threatening gestures that Marcus had allegedly made. Most importantly, he could not explain why the security camera footage showed a completely different version of events than what he had described in his report. Officer Rodriguez, Sarah asked during cross-examination, "In your police report, you stated that Mr. Williams was verbally aggressive and used profanity during the traffic stop. Can you tell the court exactly what profanity he used?" The officer hesitated and looked uncomfortable. "I don't remember the exact words," he finally admitted. "You don't remember?" Sarah pressed. "This was such a serious incident that you felt compelled to arrest a decorated Navy SEAL, but you cannot remember what he said that was so offensive." Officer Rodriguez squirmed in his seat and gave vague answers that made it clear he was making up his testimony as he went along. The people in the gallery could see that the officer was lying, and several of them shook their heads in disgust at his dishonesty. Sarah then played the security camera footage again, pointing out specific moments that contradicted Officer Rodriguez's testimony. The video showed Marcus keeping his hands visible at all times, speaking in a calm voice, and following every instruction the officer gave him. There was no evidence of any aggressive behavior or resistance. Officer Rodriguez, Sarah continued, "This video shows Mr. Williams cooperating fully with your instructions. Can you explain why your report describes behavior that is completely different from what we can see with our own eyes?" The officer mumbled something about the camera angle being misleading, but his explanation was unconvincing. Even Prosecutor Martinez seemed to realize that her case was falling apart, and she began objecting to Sarah's questions more frequently in an attempt to prevent further damage to her witness's credibility. Judge Harrison came to the prosecution's rescue by sustaining objections that should have been overruled and by limiting Sarah's time for cross-examination. When Sarah asked for additional time to question the officer about other inconsistencies in his testimony, Judge Harrison denied her request without explanation. During a brief recess, several court reporters and legal observers gathered in the hallway to discuss what they were witnessing. Many of them had covered hundreds of trials, but they had never seen such obvious bias from a judge. One veteran court reporter whispered that she was considering filing a complaint with the State Judicial Conduct Board. Local news reporters had also begun to take notice of the trial. A reporter from the city's largest newspaper approached Sarah during the recess and asked her about the judge's behavior. Sarah was careful with her words, but she made it clear that she believed her client was not receiving a fair trial. "Every defendant deserves equal treatment under the law," Sarah told the reporter. "Mr. Williams is a decorated veteran who has served his country with honor. He should receive the same consideration as any other citizen in this courtroom." The reporter asked Marcus for his thoughts on the trial, and Marcus chose his words carefully. "I have faith in the American justice system," he said. "I believe that truth will eventually prevail, even when the process is difficult." But privately, Marcus was beginning to lose confidence in the system he had sworn to protect. He had seen combat in some of the most dangerous places in the world, but he had never felt as helpless as he did sitting in that courtroom watching his reputation being destroyed by lies and prejudice. As the trial continued, more evidence emerged that supported Marcus's innocence. Traffic cameras from the area showed that he had been driving safely and legally. Cell phone records proved that he had not been using his phone while driving. Bank records showed that he had been at the VA hospital exactly when he said he was. But Judge Harrison seemed determined to ignore any evidence that favored Marcus. The judge's bias was becoming so obvious that even some of the prosecution team appeared uncomfortable with the proceedings. On the fourth day of the trial, something happened that shocked everyone in the courtroom and would later make national news. The morning had started normally, with Sarah Chen presenting character witnesses who testified about Marcus's outstanding reputation in the community. A retired general spoke about Marcus's heroic actions in Afghanistan. A fellow veteran described how Marcus had saved his life during a dangerous mission. The pastor from Marcus's church talked about his volunteer work with homeless veterans. Each witness painted a picture of Marcus as a man of integrity and honor who had dedicated his life to serving others. Their testimonies were powerful and moving, and even some members of the prosecution team seemed impressed by the overwhelming evidence of Marcus's good character. Judge Harrison listened to these testimonies with obvious irritation. He frequently interrupted the witnesses with unnecessary questions and objections. He checked his watch repeatedly and made it clear that he considered the character witnesses to be a waste of time. When the pastor mentioned Marcus's volunteer work at a homeless shelter, Judge Harrison actually rolled his eyes in annoyance. After the final character witness finished testifying, Judge Harrison called for a 15-minute recess. During the break, Marcus noticed that the judge was having a heated conversation with his clerk. Other people in the courtroom were discussing the powerful testimonies they had just heard, and many seemed confident that Marcus would be vindicated. When court resumed, Judge Harrison looked directly at Marcus with cold, calculating eyes. The judge's expression was different from before, more hostile and determined. Sarah Chen sensed that something was wrong, but she had no idea what the judge was planning. "Mr. Williams," Judge Harrison said in a voice that carried throughout the silent courtroom, "I have been observing your behavior throughout this trial. I find your demeanor to be disrespectful and arrogant. You sit in my courtroom as if you are above the law, as if your military service makes you special." Marcus was stunned by the judge's words. He had been nothing but respectful throughout the entire trial. He had dressed professionally, had remained quiet during proceedings, and had shown proper courtroom etiquette at all times. Sarah quickly stood up to object to the judge's inappropriate comments. "Your Honor, my client has shown nothing but respect for this court," Sarah said firmly. "He has followed all courtroom procedures and has been a model defendant throughout these proceedings." Marcus took a deep breath and drew upon the same courage that had carried him through countless dangerous missions in Afghanistan. He looked directly at Judge Harrison with steady, unwavering eyes and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried throughout the silent courtroom. "Your Honor," Marcus said with quiet dignity, "I have knelt before God in prayer, and I have knelt beside the graves of fallen comrades to honor their sacrifice. But I will not kneel in a court of law where I am supposed to receive equal justice under the law that I swore to defend with my life." The courtroom remained completely silent as Marcus's words sank in. His statement was respectful but firm, delivered without anger or disrespect, but with an unshakable conviction that some principles were worth standing for regardless of the consequences. Judge Harrison's face turned bright red with rage. He began pounding his gavel furiously while shouting at Marcus about contempt of court and disrespect for judicial authority. The judge's loss of composure was shocking to witness, and it became clear to everyone present that his demand for Marcus to kneel had been motivated by prejudice rather than any legitimate legal purpose. "You will kneel, or I will add contempt of court to your charges," Judge Harrison screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "I will not tolerate this disrespect in my courtroom." Sarah Chen immediately moved to have Judge Harrison recused from the case due to obvious bias and inappropriate conduct. She argued that the judge's demand was not only unconstitutional, but also revealed his prejudice against her client. Her motion was supported by legal precedent and constitutional law, but Judge Harrison refused to consider it. The veterans in the gallery began standing one by one in silent support of Marcus's decision. First, an elderly man who had served in Vietnam slowly rose to his feet. Then a young woman who had served in Iraq stood up. Within moments, nearly every veteran in the courtroom was standing in solidarity with Marcus, creating a powerful visual that would later become one of the most iconic images of the civil rights movement. The court reporter continued documenting every word and action, knowing that she was witnessing a historic moment that would be studied and remembered for generations. Her fingers moved quickly across her keyboard as she recorded Judge Harrison's increasingly erratic behavior and Marcus's dignified responses. Marcus remained standing with his shoulders straight and his head held high. Despite the judge's threats and intimidation, he maintained his composure and his commitment to his principles. His refusal to kneel was not an act of defiance or disrespect, but rather an affirmation of the constitutional values he had fought to protect overseas. "Your Honor," Sarah said, trying to restore order to the chaotic courtroom, "my client has shown nothing but respect for this court and for the law. His refusal to participate in this inappropriate ritual does not constitute contempt of court. In fact, forcing him to kneel would violate his constitutional rights and his human dignity." Judge Harrison ignored Sarah's legal arguments and continued his tirade against Marcus. He threatened to have Marcus arrested immediately and to add years to his potential sentence. The judge's behavior was becoming increasingly unhinged, and even Prosecutor Martinez appeared uncomfortable with what she was witnessing. Meanwhile, the story was exploding across social media and news networks. Videos of Judge Harrison's order and Marcus's response were being shared millions of times within the first hour. The hashtag #MarcusStands became the top trending topic on Twitter, with people from around the world expressing support for the Navy SEALs' courageous stand. Legal experts on television were calling Judge Harrison's behavior a disgrace to the judicial system and a throwback to the darkest days of American history. Constitutional scholars explained that forcing a defendant to kneel was unprecedented in American jurisprudence and violated multiple amendments to the Constitution. Civil rights organizations immediately began mobilizing support for Marcus. The NAACP issued a statement calling for Judge Harrison's immediate removal from the bench. Veterans organizations condemned the judge's treatment of a decorated war hero. Even some conservative commentators who typically supported law and order criticized the judge's inappropriate demand. Back in the courtroom, Judge Harrison was still shouting and threatening Marcus with additional charges. The judge's lack of self-control was shocking to witness, and it became clear that he had lost all pretense of judicial neutrality. His personal prejudices were now on full display for everyone to see. Marcus continued to stand silently, his presence a stark contrast to the judge's emotional outburst. His calm dignity in the face of injustice inspired people around the world who were watching the drama unfold on their screens. Many compared his quiet courage to that of civil rights heroes like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Sarah Chen was frantically working to protect her client's rights while also documenting the judge's misconduct for future appeals. She knew that Judge Harrison's behavior would be grounds for overturning any conviction, but she also knew that the damage to Marcus's reputation and career could be irreversible. The bailiff, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, appeared uncomfortable with the situation, but was unsure of how to respond. Sheriff's deputies who were present to maintain order looked confused by the judge's unprecedented demands and seemed reluctant to take any action against Marcus. As the chaos continued, news crews began arriving at the courthouse. Reporters who had been following the story online rushed to the scene to provide live coverage of the dramatic confrontation. Camera crews set up outside the courthouse, and news anchors began providing continuous coverage of what was being called the trial of the century. Inside the courtroom, Marcus remained standing as a symbol of dignity and constitutional rights. His refusal to be humiliated had transformed him from a defendant into a civil rights icon. His courage in the face of judicial abuse inspired millions of people who were following his story. The confrontation between Marcus and Judge Harrison had reached a critical point, with neither man willing to back down from their positions. The entire legal system seemed to be holding its breath as the dramatic standoff continued, with the whole world watching to see how this unprecedented situation would be resolved. Just as Judge Harrison raised his gavel to hold Marcus in contempt of court, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a loud bang that echoed throughout the tense room. Every head turned to see who was entering at this crucial moment, and a collective gasp arose from the gallery when they recognized the familiar figure striding purposefully down the center aisle. Senator Patricia Williams, one of the most powerful and respected members of the United States Senate, walked into the courtroom with the confidence and authority that came from 30 years of public service. She was a tall, elegant woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room, as everyone recognized that they were now in the presence of someone who could change the course of this trial. Senator Williams was not just any politician. She was the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which oversaw the appointment and conduct of federal judges. She was also a former prosecutor and civil rights attorney who had built her career fighting against exactly the kind of injustice that Marcus was experiencing. Her arrival at this moment was not a coincidence, but a calculated decision to witness firsthand what her staff had been reporting about Judge Harrison's conduct. The senator's entrance was followed by a small group of aides and two men in dark suits who were clearly Secret Service agents. News crews that had been gathering outside the courthouse also entered, having been alerted to the senator's arrival. Camera operators quickly set up their equipment while reporters prepared to document whatever was about to happen. Judge Harrison's face went completely pale when he saw Senator Williams. His hand, which had been raised to strike the gavel, slowly lowered as he realized that his actions were now under the direct scrutiny of someone who had the power to end his judicial career with a single phone call. The judge's previous confidence and arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by obvious nervousness and fear. "Your Honor," Judge Harrison stammered, his voice suddenly much quieter and less threatening than it had been moments before. "We are in the middle of court proceedings. This is highly irregular." Senator Williams ignored the judge's protest and walked calmly to an empty seat in the front row of the gallery. She sat down with deliberate composure, crossed her legs, and fixed Judge Harrison with a steady stare that conveyed both her authority and her disapproval of what she had witnessed. Her presence sent a clear message that the entire proceeding was now under federal scrutiny. The news cameras captured every moment of the senator's entrance and her silent but powerful statement of support for Marcus. Within minutes, breaking news alerts were appearing on television screens across the country, announcing that Senator Williams had personally intervened in the trial of the Navy SEAL who had refused to kneel. Marcus felt a surge of hope for the first time since his ordeal had begun. He had heard of Senator Williams and knew her reputation as a fierce advocate for justice and civil rights. Her presence in the courtroom meant that his case had attracted the attention of the highest levels of government, and that powerful allies were now standing with him in his fight for justice. Sarah Chen was equally relieved by the senator's arrival. She knew that Judge Harrison would not dare to continue his inappropriate behavior with Senator Williams watching. The judge's previous threats and intimidation tactics would now be impossible to implement without facing serious consequences from the Senate Judiciary Committee. Judge Harrison attempted to regain control of his courtroom, but his previous authority had been completely undermined by the senator's presence. He shuffled his papers nervously and tried to speak with confidence, but his voice betrayed his anxiety about the situation he now found himself in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Harrison said, trying to sound official, "we will continue with these proceedings in an orderly fashion. The defendant will comply with the court's instructions or face the consequences." But his words lacked the threatening tone they had carried just minutes earlier. Everyone in the courtroom could see that the judge was now afraid of the political and professional consequences of his actions. The presence of Senator Williams had effectively neutered his ability to continue his abuse of power. Senator Williams remained silent, but her message was clear. She had positioned herself as a witness to the proceedings, and her presence ensured that any further misconduct by Judge Harrison would be reported directly to the highest levels of the federal government. The judge's behavior was now a matter of national importance, not just a local court case. The news coverage of Senator Williams's intervention was immediate and extensive. Every major news network interrupted their regular programming to report on the dramatic development in Marcus's trial. Political commentators began analyzing the significance of the senator's decision to personally involve herself in the case. "This is unprecedented," said one legal expert on CNN. "For a sitting U.S. senator to personally intervene in a state court trial sends a powerful message about the seriousness of the judicial misconduct that has been reported in this case." Social media exploded with praise for Senator Williams's intervention. The hashtag #SenatorStands began trending alongside Marcus stands as people expressed their gratitude that a powerful political figure was willing to stand up for justice and constitutional rights. Inside the courtroom, the dynamic had completely shifted. Judge Harrison, who had been acting like a tyrant just minutes before, was now clearly intimidated by the presence of someone who could hold him accountable for his actions. His previous demands for Marcus to kneel were now impossible to enforce without creating a national scandal. Marcus remained standing with dignity, but now he was no longer standing alone. Senator Williams's presence had given him powerful political support, and her reputation for fighting injustice had inspired people across the country to rally behind his cause. The confrontation that had seemed hopeless just moments before had now become a national cause caliber, with one of the most powerful people in Washington personally ensuring that Marcus would receive the fair treatment that every American deserves in a court of law. Senator Williams sat quietly in the gallery for several tense minutes, allowing her presence to sink in and observing Judge Harrison's increasingly nervous behavior. The judge kept glancing in her direction, clearly uncomfortable with being watched by someone who had the authority to investigate his conduct. Finally, the senator stood up and requested permission to address the court. "Your Honor," Senator Williams said in a voice that commanded immediate attention, "I am Senator Patricia Williams, and I serve on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I would like to request a moment to speak to this court about the proceedings I have witnessed here today." Judge Harrison found himself in an impossible position. He could not refuse a sitting U.S. senator without creating an even bigger scandal, but he also knew that allowing her to speak would expose his misconduct to even greater scrutiny. After a moment of hesitation, he reluctantly granted her request. Senator Williams walked to the center of the courtroom with the confidence of someone who had spent decades fighting for justice in the highest levels of government. She looked directly at Marcus with respect and admiration, then turned to address the entire courtroom with words that would be remembered for generations. "Ladies and gentlemen," the senator began, "I am here today because I have been monitoring reports of judicial misconduct in this courtroom. What I have witnessed in the past few minutes has deeply troubled me as an American, as a former prosecutor, and as someone who has dedicated her life to ensuring equal justice under law." Her words carried the weight of moral authority and political power. Every person in the courtroom hung on her every word, knowing that they were witnessing a historic moment in the fight for civil rights and judicial fairness. "Mr. Williams," she continued, looking directly at Marcus, "you are a decorated Navy SEAL who has risked your life to defend the Constitution of the United States. The same Constitution that guarantees you the right to be treated with dignity and respect in any American courtroom. No defendant, regardless of race or background, should ever be ordered to kneel before a judge as some kind of degrading ritual." The senator's speech was being broadcast live on every major news network, and her words were being shared millions of times on social media. People across the country and around the world were watching as one of America's most powerful politicians took a stand for justice and human dignity. The principles that Mr. Williams fought to defend overseas, Senator Williams continued, are the same principles that must be upheld in our courtrooms here at home. Equal treatment under law is not negotiable. Judicial impartiality is not optional. Constitutional rights are not subject to the personal prejudices of any individual, no matter how much authority they may hold. Judge Harrison sat silently behind his bench, his face growing redder with each word the senator spoke. He knew that his career was effectively over, but he was powerless to stop the criticism that was now coming from one of the most influential people in Washington. The senator announced that she would be calling for an immediate investigation into Judge Harrison's conduct by the State Judicial Oversight Board. She also promised to introduce federal legislation to prevent similar abuses of judicial power in the future. Her words sent shockwaves through the legal community, as judges across the country realized that their conduct would now face increased scrutiny. "I will be working with my colleagues in Congress," Senator Williams declared, "to ensure that what happened in this courtroom today can never happen again. We will be introducing the Marcus Williams Judicial Accountability Act, which will establish new oversight mechanisms for state court judges and provide better protection for defendants' constitutional rights." The mention of Marcus's name in the proposed legislation brought tears to the eyes of many people in the gallery. The young Navy SEAL who had simply been driving home from volunteer work had now become the symbol of a national movement for judicial reform and civil rights. During the senator's speech, more high-ranking officials began arriving at the courthouse. The state attorney general sent representatives to observe the proceedings. Civil rights organizations dispatched their top lawyers to offer support to Marcus. Military officials from the Pentagon issued public statements supporting their fellow servicemen. Judge Harrison, realizing that his position had become completely untenable, called for a lengthy recess. He retreated to his chambers, where he spent the next hour on phone calls with lawyers and judicial administrators. The pressure from media attention, political scrutiny, and professional consequences had become overwhelming. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison appeared to be a different person. His previous arrogance and hostility had been replaced by obvious anxiety and defeat. He knew that continuing to preside over Marcus's case would only bring more negative attention to his conduct and further damage his already ruined reputation. After careful consideration, Judge Harrison announced in a shaky voice, "I have decided to recuse myself from this case due to scheduling conflicts and other considerations. A new judge will be appointed to handle the remaining proceedings." Everyone in the courtroom knew that scheduling conflicts was simply a face-saving excuse. The real reason for Judge Harrison's recusal was the overwhelming pressure from Senator Williams's intervention and the national attention his misconduct had attracted. His career as a judge was effectively over, even if he tried to claim otherwise. The prosecution team huddled together nervously during the recess, realizing that their case was completely falling apart. Prosecutor Martinez had built her case around the assumption that Judge Harrison would be biased in favor of the state. But now, she would have to present her weak evidence to a fair and impartial judge who would actually follow the law. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and vindication as he watched Judge Harrison announce his recusal. The man who had tried to humiliate and degrade him was now facing the consequences of his own prejudice and misconduct. Justice was finally beginning to prevail, even though the process had been long and difficult. Senator Williams remained in the courtroom until the end of the day's proceedings, ensuring that her presence continued to send a message about the importance of judicial fairness. Her staff was already working on the promised legislation, and legal experts were drafting new guidelines for judicial conduct that would prevent future abuses. As news of Judge Harrison's recusal spread across the country, people celebrated what they saw as a victory for justice and constitutional rights. Marcus had stood up to an abusive judge and had won, but more importantly, he had sparked a national conversation about equality and fairness in the American legal system. The day that had started with threats and intimidation had ended with hope and vindication. Marcus's courage in refusing to kneel had not only protected his own dignity, but had also inspired millions of people to demand better from their judicial system. The fight for justice was far from over, but an important battle had been won. Within 1 week of Judge Harrison's recusal, a new judge named Maria Martinez was assigned to Marcus's case. Judge Martinez had an excellent reputation for fairness and impartiality, and she had been specifically chosen because of her experience handling civil rights cases. Unlike her predecessor, Judge Martinez was known for following the law rather than her personal prejudices. The new trial proceedings began immediately, and the difference in atmosphere was remarkable. Judge Martinez treated both the prosecution and defense with equal respect and consideration. She listened carefully to all evidence and made decisions based on legal merit rather than bias. The courtroom felt like a place where justice could actually be achieved. Sarah Chen presented the same evidence that Judge Harrison had tried to ignore, but now it received the fair consideration it deserved. The security camera footage that clearly showed Marcus cooperating with Officer Rodriguez was given proper weight. The testimony of character witnesses was treated with the respect it merited. The inconsistencies in the officer's testimony were properly examined and exposed. It took Judge Martinez less than 2 hours to review all the evidence before making her decision. The video footage alone was enough to prove that Officer Rodriguez had completely fabricated his report about Marcus's behavior during the traffic stop. The officer's testimony was so full of contradictions and lies that it could not be believed on any level. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison appeared to be a different person. His previous arrogance and hostility had been replaced by obvious anxiety and defeat. He knew that continuing to preside over Marcus's case would only bring more negative attention to his conduct and further damage his already ruined reputation. After careful consideration, Judge Harrison announced in a shaky voice, "I have decided to recuse myself from this case due to scheduling conflicts and other considerations. A new judge will be appointed to handle the remaining proceedings." Everyone in the courtroom knew that scheduling conflicts was simply a face-saving excuse. The real reason for Judge Harrison's recusal was the overwhelming pressure from Senator Williams's intervention and the national attention his misconduct had attracted. His career as a judge was effectively over, even if he tried to claim otherwise. The prosecution team huddled together nervously during the recess, realizing that their case was completely falling apart. Prosecutor Martinez had built her case around the assumption that Judge Harrison would be biased in favor of the state, but now she would have to present her weak evidence to a fair and impartial judge who would actually follow the law. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and vindication as he watched Judge Harrison announce his recusal. The man who had tried to humiliate and degrade him was now facing the consequences of his own prejudice and misconduct. Justice was finally beginning to prevail, even though the process had been long and difficult. Senator Williams remained in the courtroom until the end of the day's proceedings, ensuring that her presence continued to send a message about the importance of judicial fairness. Her staff was already working on the promised legislation, and legal experts were drafting new guidelines for judicial conduct that would prevent future abuses. As news of Judge Harrison's recusal spread across the country, people celebrated what they saw as a victory for justice and constitutional rights. Marcus had stood up to an abusive judge and had won, but more importantly, he had sparked a national conversation about equality and fairness in the American legal system. The day that had started with threats and intimidation had ended with hope and vindication. Marcus's courage in refusing to kneel had not only protected his own dignity, but had also inspired millions of people to demand better from their judicial system. The fight for justice was far from over, but an important battle had been won. Within 1 week of Judge Harrison's recusal, a new judge named Maria Martinez was assigned to Marcus's case. Judge Martinez had an excellent reputation for fairness and impartiality, and she had been specifically chosen because of her experience handling civil rights cases. Unlike her predecessor, Judge Martinez was known for following the law rather than her personal prejudices. The new trial proceedings began immediately, and the difference in atmosphere was remarkable. Judge Martinez treated both the prosecution and defense with equal respect and consideration. She listened carefully to all evidence and made decisions based on legal merit rather than bias. The courtroom felt like a place where justice could actually be achieved. Sarah Chen presented the same evidence that Judge Harrison had tried to ignore, but now it received the fair consideration it deserved. The security camera footage that clearly showed Marcus cooperating with Officer Rodriguez was given proper weight. The testimony of character witnesses was treated with the respect it merited. The inconsistencies in the officer's testimony were properly examined and exposed. It took Judge Martinez less than 2 hours to review all the evidence before making her decision. The video footage alone was enough to prove that Officer Rodriguez had completely fabricated his report about Marcus's behavior during the traffic stop. The officer's testimony was so full of contradictions and lies that it could not be believed on any level. After careful review of all evidence presented in this case, Judge Martinez announced, "I find that the prosecution has failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt." In fact, the evidence clearly shows that the defendant was cooperative and respectful throughout the traffic stop in question. The charges of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as Marcus's supporters celebrated his complete vindication. Marcus himself felt overwhelming relief and gratitude as he realized that his nightmare was finally over. He had been proven innocent of all charges, and his reputation had been restored through the proper application of justice. But the consequences of this case extended far beyond Marcus's personal vindication. Judge Harrison faced a formal investigation by the State Judicial Conduct Board, which quickly found evidence of a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning many years. The investigation revealed dozens of cases where minority defendants had received unfair treatment in his courtroom. Within 6 months, Judge Harrison was formally removed from the bench and permanently banned from serving in any judicial capacity. He also faced potential criminal charges for civil rights violations, as federal prosecutors began investigating whether his conduct constituted a criminal conspiracy to deny citizens their constitutional rights. Officer Rodriguez faced even more serious consequences for his role in fabricating the charges against Marcus. An internal affairs investigation found that he had filed false reports in multiple cases, not just Marcus. He was immediately terminated from the police force and faced criminal charges for perjury, filing false reports, and civil rights violations. The police department where Rodriguez had worked also faced a federal investigation into their hiring and training practices. The case sparked reforms in police procedures and led to better training for officers about constitutional rights and proper conduct during traffic stops. Senator Williams kept her promise to introduce federal legislation addressing judicial misconduct. The Marcus Williams Judicial Accountability Act passed Congress with strong bipartisan support and was signed into law by the president 6 months after Marcus's trial ended. The law established new oversight mechanisms for state court judges and created better protections for defendants' constitutional rights. The legislation required all judges to undergo annual training on constitutional rights and bias prevention. It also created new procedures for reporting and investigating judicial misconduct, making it easier to remove judges who abused their power. Civil rights organizations hailed the law as one of the most important judicial reform measures in decades. Marcus used his newfound fame and platform to advocate for other victims of judicial misconduct and police abuse. He completed his law degree and passed the bar exam, then opened a civil rights law practice that specialized in helping veterans and minorities who faced discrimination in the legal system. His law firm, called Equal Justice Legal Services, provided free legal representation to people who could not afford lawyers but needed help fighting against systemic discrimination. Marcus used his military training and legal education to become one of the most effective civil rights attorneys in the country. Marcus also became a sought-after speaker at law schools, military academies, and civil rights conferences. He spoke about the importance of standing up for constitutional principles, even when facing powerful opposition. His story inspired a new generation of lawyers, soldiers, and activists to fight for justice and equality. The courtroom where Marcus had been ordered to kneel was eventually renamed the Civil Rights Memorial Courtroom, in honor of all the people who had fought against discrimination in the American legal system. A plaque near the entrance told the story of Marcus's courage and the reforms that resulted from his stand for dignity. Years later, Marcus would often return to that courtroom to argue cases for his clients. Each time he stood before the bench, he remembered the moment when he had refused to kneel and had instead chosen to stand for the principles that made America great. His courage had not only saved his own future, but had also made the entire justice system more fair and equal for everyone. The case that had started with a simple traffic stop had become a landmark moment in American civil rights history. Marcus Williams, the Navy SEAL who had refused to kneel, had shown that one person's courage could change the world and that justice would eventually prevail when good people stood up for what was right. His story continued to inspire people around the world who faced discrimination and injustice. Marcus proved that standing up for your principles, even when facing powerful opposition, could lead to positive change that would benefit future generations. The young man who had once served his country overseas had ended up serving it just as effectively in a courtroom, fighting to ensure that the Constitution he had sworn to defend would protect all Americans equally.